welcome. It's great to see such a great crowd. We here at Wesleyan are very lucky to have Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore with us today. And so first I want to thank the institutional support that made this possible. The American Studies Department, the Center for the Americas, the English Department, Writing at Wesleyan, the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and the student group Queer Wes. It was their support that made this reading possible. Thanks go to Laura Borman for her administrative support in making this event work. And she just took off, so thank you, Laura. I remember the first time I saw Mattilda speak. I think it was at the National Women's Studies Conference in 2006. It was definitely in Oakland. We were in a conference room, maybe at the Marriott. Many of you can picture it well. Can you picture it? And rising up at the front of the room, Mattilda. She was transfixing, puncturing the blandness of the room and that conference immediately. I'd known her work, had read it and reread it, but still I was surprised, not by the force and clarity of her critique and her queer political vision, but by her humor, her style. You can hear that style, that sharp intelligence in her explanation of her politics as a feminist politics of challenging power, centered on challenging racism, classism, colonialism, and imperialism, misogyny, and homophobia, in her vision of creating the possibility of commonality by expressing the absolute core of difference. She has nurtured this possibility through her activism, from her work with ACT UP San Francisco in the early 1990s to New York's Fed Up Queers, and back to San Francisco with Gay Shame, whose street actions protesting the politics of the city's LGBT center, the corporatization of gay pride, or the gentrifying campaigns of Mayor Gavin Newsom I found electrifying living in San Francisco at the time. And she has challenged power through her writing, publishing 2 novels, So Many Ways to Sleep Badly and Pulling Taffy, and 5 nonfiction anthologies. Why Are Faggots So Afraid of Faggots? Flaming Challenges to Masculinity, Objectification, and the Desire to Conform. Nobody Passes, Rejecting the Rules of Gender and Conformity. That's Revolting, Queer Strategies for Resisting Assimilation. Dangerous Families, Queer Writing on Surviving. And Tricks and Treats, Sex Workers Write About Their Clients. Throughout, she creates scathing political analysis without the deadening seriousness so common not only to academic, but also activist critique. For, as she tells us, I have to be critical in order to stay alive, and being critical is what gives me hope. Hope in radical queer dreams, in creating community. This is the possibility in being queer, knowing you can start out one place and end up someplace else. That hope for or of someplace else is central to her memoir, The End of San Francisco, which we have the pleasure of hearing today. The End of San Francisco has been praised extensively by critics from the San Francisco Bay Guardian, the LA Review of Books, San Francisco Chronicle, Lambda Literary Review, the Chicago Reader, and Psychology Today, which calls the memoir one of the most important memoirs of the decade. The End of San Francisco is a memoir of loss and of hope, escape and freedom, alienation and connection. It is radical not just in content, but in form. I won't embarrass the students here today by reading from the papers they wrote on the End of San Francisco. I will only tell you all that if Mattilda's hope is, as she says, to create opportunities to ask questions about gender and power and intimacy and love and lust and longing, questions about when we fail, about all our dreams that lead to nothing, and how do we get somewhere else, she has most certainly succeeded. It is a dream to be able to welcome Mattilda to Wesleyan. There are copies of all of her books in the hallway available. And stick around after the reading for a question and answer session and then a reception. So with that, please extend a warm welcome to Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Linda. That was wonderful. I forgot about the National Women's Studies Association conference. That was a funny event because that was when one of my anthologies, Nobody Passes, Rejecting the Rules of Gender and Conformity, came out. And I was on this panel with, that was published by Seal Press. And the tagline of Seal Press started as a feminist press in the 70s, but at this point, which was 2006, I believe, their tagline was simply books by women for women, right? So it kind of had degraded the feminist politic into this simplistic identity rhetoric without any of the foundational analysis. And they were having a little bit of a trans moment at the time, and they were incorporating, various gender possibilities into this idea of books by women for women. We had a lot of controversy. I mean, they actually approached me to do this book, but they really wanted me to, they were comfortable with me just saying, oh, okay, I'm a woman, and they'd be like, oh, sure. That's okay. And so they were like, at one point during the conversations about the book that they had approached me to do, they said, well, what is your gender identity, by the way, And I said, well, I identify as a genderqueer faggot and a queen on the trans continuum and the trans feminine direction, but I'm not interested in, conventional ideals of male and female. I'd rather create something more devious and defiant, And so they were like, that's interesting. But on that panel, I believe it was me, and then it was Max Valerio, whose book had preceded mine, and his book is a sort of trans man coming of age, sort of the conventional arc of trans identity, from born in the, quote, wrong gender and ending up in, a more comfortable place, in his case, within masculinity. And then the other person on the panel was Julia Serrano, who, or it was Julia was on there, I think, and then there was actually a fourth person. But anyway, it was actually my editor at Seal Press had consciously put me on this panel where the other panelists were talking about this idea of like natural, these were trans panelists talking about natural, essential, gender identity, and I was like, this is not really happening. But she had it was a setup to have this argument between us, which I think was clever as an editor, but it might have been interesting to tell us at a time, right? And it's always interesting, how many conferences take place in these like prison industrial complex cornerstones, like the Marriott, right? But it was I enjoyed it. I'm going to keep taking sips of water. Feel free to come in, sit down. There's no need to worry about interrupting or anything like that. Come on in, sit down. Make yourself comfortable. So, of course, during the reading, I can tell already this is a good audience, but, feel free. The only bad audience, as far as I'm concerned, is the dead audience, right? So, if you need to get up, if you need to stretch, if you need to eat something, if you need to laugh, if you need to cry, if you need to, scream and yell, do whatever the fuck you need, you know what I mean? I know you didn't come to Wesleyan for anything less. So this is a beautiful surrounding. I love these chandeliers, by the way. I made a short film with a friend called All That Sheltering Emptiness, and all the visuals in the film are actually blurred and distorted hotel chandeliers. So I have a big appreciation for chandeliers and all the forms they come in. And feel free to ask me about that if you'd like. So today, after sucking briefly on a throw lozenge, okay, good. Just have to moisten my throat. This is a good mic, though. Are you hearing me? Is it pretty good? Yeah, it's not too loud, not too soft. It's working. Okay, good. I like it. So I think I'm going to read some excerpts from my new book, The End of San Francisco. It is a memoir, but not a memoir in the traditional sense, right? I think traditional memoir has the wonderful ability to take the most fascinating, multifaceted, complicated, and messy lives and turn them into packaged products for the titillation of a passive audience, right? So we don't need any more passive audiences. We don't need any more titillation or packaged products, right? We got plenty of that in this country and around the world. So I'm more interested in creating something, deeper, messier, more emotionally present, and of course, non-linear. So the book, instead of plotting this conventional, when I'm dead in the ground, right, maybe you can fly over in a helicopter and, plot everything out from point A to point B, C, and all the way down to Z, right? But until then, everything's going to go in all directions. So that's what this book does. It goes in all directions. And what guides it is not the conventions of plot structure, right? Like, whoever created that, speaking of prisons, right? God, plot structure. Like plotting towards this determined endpoint of packaged revelation and, just tragedy, right? I mean, so many books are ruined by plot, right? God, if you could take something out of most of the books that are published in this country, take the plot out. Just take it out. And often it happens in the ending, right? Because the ending, it's like, oh look, now we understand everything. Especially in memoir, right? Memoir, it's like, oh no, I've survived, and everything is wonderful, or it's like, oh, I can bend, it's just. So it's dead, basically. It's dead even if it's alive, and so I'm more interested in creating something that's actually alive. And so the book is structured by emotion rather than conventional plot structure. And it starts, with the end, it ends in the beginning, and in between, everything else happens. So it's been interesting, reading different sections from the book in different places, and I get kind of attached, because it's hard to, show what the hell happens in this book, that is always going in all directions by just reading, a few excerpts. So I get attached to certain pieces, and so tonight I'm trying to break that attachment, right? And I don't know exactly what I'm gonna do, but I'm gonna read several excerpts, and I have decided on what they are, but I may change my mind. Although I will say, I think the reading just before this I read in Baltimore, and I read at Red Emma's, which is an anarchist space, and they just opened a new store, and it's huge. I couldn't even believe it, because the sort of common knowledge, right, in the world, right now is that books are dead, right, and that radical spaces, they don't even exist, right, and so here's this radical space centered around books, opening this huge new space, so it's kind of fascinating. But in the reading, I changed, what I was going to read based on my ideas of how I thought the crowd was reacting or something. I think I made a little bit of a mistake. The crowd liked it, but what it actually ended up creating were all these, also I think it was the space, but all the questions were very centered around, they were distant political questions, which are interesting, but they're not that interesting for me in the context of reading from this book in particular. If I'm on a panel and it's like, oh, we're going to talk about abstract, fill in the blank, right? Let's say gentrification. So they were like, solve gentrification for us right now. And I'm like, you gotta do that, okay? You're the ones opening up this space and participating in gentrification, even if it is a beautiful space. I don't live in Baltimore, I can't answer those questions. But I didn't say that, I tried to be as present as possible. I can only think of those answers when I have a little bit of distance. But so it's nice to be here tonight at Wesleyan. I almost went to Wesleyan, which is kind of interesting. So back in 1991, I visited. I really, my favorite thing when I visited, I guess I must have visited in 1990, is there still this underground thing covered in graffiti? It's maybe part of the art place. And so the person who was giving us a tour was like, oh, you can do anything you want, you can create anything you want, and everyone mostly just likes to hang out here and do drugs. And I was like, oh, that's great. I was like, say that again?
They closed it.
Oh, it's gone. So you can't hang out there and do drugs anymore. Do people break in from time to time? Okay, good. Do they do drugs?
Yeah.
Okay, good. But not as open, so now it's more clandestine, a little more. I mean, some of these chandeliers would probably look really good down there. So I think I'm gonna. Oh, another thing, in writing this book, it was interesting. I was really drawn to writing about the places where my analysis stops. The gaps, and also the things that it took me maybe 20 years to write about. And some of them are more surprising to other people than they were to me, in terms of, but one of them was, I guess about what happened when I got to the place where I went instead of Wesleyan. So it's a very similar place in some ways. So I think there are actually some very direct correlations, in fact, between this place and Wesleyan. So that'll probably come up in the question and answer, I'm guessing. So please tell me. Let me look at the page number. There we go. When you go to a school like Brown, they tell you not to get overwhelmed. Not to get overwhelmed because you're used to thinking you're the smartest person, but now you're surrounded by so many others who are used to thinking the same thing. I wasn't overwhelmed at all. There were smart people and there were clueless people, just like anywhere else. The difference was that it was actually okay to be smart. Smart and creative and strange at the same time. And that made me feel stronger and stranger too. So let me tell you about SAMA, Students for Aid and Minority Admissions. We took over University Hall, the main administrative building, and it was a big deal. We were protesting the university's policy of openly excluding potential students based on their inability to pay. The university called this need aware. So we took over the building and 253 people got arrested. The cops brought us downtown to jail in buses, late at night, but right to court where they charged us with 5 misdemeanors, which included a $3,000 fine, and the mic goes out at that moment. If convicted, you still hear me probably, but the mic is gone, right? Oh. Do you think that's the university turning the mic off? Tonight we're taking over Russell House now that the microphone is off. Should we click a button to turn it back on, or do we just keep going? Say that again.
It seems like it's kind of on.
It's off, but it's just me. But that's okay. Is it okay? How's it for the recording to just switch like that? Oh, it's perfect. Great. I'm sure you can still hear me with my soft, gentle voice. Yeah. We were there until 2:30 a.m. Well, then I'll just move this over because it's not, right? It's the same, yeah. It must have been a special proceeding just for us, but I don't remember realizing that. I do remember thinking about the irony of the university trying to force protesting students, many on financial aid, to pay a $2,000 fine. We talked about that a lot. After that arrest, I would go to SAMA meetings every day. Sometimes there were several meetings in one day, usually instead of class, which made sense because this was where I was learning everything I wanted to learn. 2 other first-year students and I wrote a 17-page document for the SAMA press kit about how need aware was a racist and classist policy. Since we were at Brown, our struggle became national news. The Washington Post did a story a few days later. CNN came to campus. We were trying to get Jesse Jackson to support us. The university denounced us. They called us violent. They continued to press charges. At one point, the new president of the university agreed to meet with us, or 12 of us who represented the steering committee. Or maybe we were the steering committee. Now, I don't believe in steering committees, but I didn't know that yet. Anyway, we met with the president. It was eerie because he knew all of our names before we introduced ourselves. He came right up to me and said, "Hi, Matt." Not even Matthew, like on my registration, shook my hand and looked me in the eyes. We'd smuggled in a tape recorder because we knew he would lie and we wanted proof. At some point, the tape ended and there was a click. I don't know how he knew this meant we had a tape recorder. Thinking about it now, I guess he probably knew in the same way that he knew our names ahead of time. Anyway, he became enraged and the meeting ended. And then, 1 week after our University Hall occupation, the Rodney King verdict was announced. There was a forum in one of the largest halls on campus, right next to University Hall. You know what they say about kids in ivory tower institutions living in a bubble. We had that conversation a lot. That's what kids in ivory tower institutions like to talk about. I didn't think I was living in a bubble, that's for sure. But there I was helping to forge a struggle for racial and economic justice, and I didn't even know the Rodney King verdict was about to take place. I'm not even sure I remembered who Rodney King was. For weeks beforehand, I'd flyered for the upcoming Sama action, talking to mostly blank faces about the importance of what we called need-blind admissions, and then those 4 LAPD officers were acquitted for the beating of Rodney King, the famous video broadcast across the country, yet somehow they were still not guilty. For days, people rioted, especially in LA, and I remember going downtown to join the protest in Providence, and then back to organize more Sama actions. Our University Hall takeover was the culmination of several years of activism on the part of students, including a 164-page report presented to the administration the year before, involving research, analysis, and recommendations. Students were doing the university's job and paying the university at the same time. What a racket. We sent out press releases and held press conferences and went flyering and tabled and made banners and signs and held pickets and organized another big demo where we planned to encircle University Hall. We got faculty and administration involved and contacted other schools protesting for equal access in Rhode Island and across the country. And I even kind of remember a march through downtown. What did it lead to? All of this struggle, years of struggle, really? Nothing. That's what it led to. Not a single structural change at the university. And that's where I learned the most. Elise and I also learned a lot from taking ecstasy that was actually acid. Although I wouldn't find out it was acid until years later. Katie sent it to me. She said it was joy, ecstasy in tab form, pure MDMA. And it was joy, the way you could see the structure of things, the structure you were trying to escape. One time, Elise and I walked by one of those emergency fire alarm things, and it fell over, crashed to the sidewalk. No alarm, and were there really sparks? Another time, we were gliding above the ground, and we made up songs for the cars. Don't run us over, that's bad. 'Cause then we would be dead. And that's sad. sad was one of the ways we connected. We could finally say it. Every day was another opportunity to break down, and to break down the breaking down. And this didn't necessarily feel hopeful, but it felt. We were feeling. Of course, we felt trapped in different ways. Late at night on weekends, we would often end up at Dunkin' Donuts after whatever party ended and we were still high. We smoked a lot of pot. It made us crazy, and we loved that. We loved being crazy late at night. We'd end up at Dunkin' Donuts. I was eating things I would never eat if I wasn't high. I'd outgrown anorexia, but I was still frightened by fat. What could be worse than donuts? Although they had muffins too. I tried to stay with muffins. And we would smoke pot in the back of Dunkin' Donuts. Sometimes we would pass out there, and in the morning people would come looking for us, our friends. If we left before morning, tripping over ourselves, and I would start to feel disgusting, back in my body the way I usually felt out of my body. I would hurl the donuts or muffins into the street, and I remember Elise was stunned that I would throw something out like that, something you could eat. I didn't think she'd told me that, not right then. She was spending more on books than her mother had for food. Once her mother sent her a rug, a woven Guatemalan rug in the style that was very popular at the time for frat boys who drank Cuervo and wore ponchos. A gesture of care, and I took one look at it and said, "That's tacky." I might have even said, "Get rid of it." Or, if I didn't say that, it's what I meant. When I first arrived at Brown, I felt a social ease that I'd never experienced before. This was one of the things that gave me a certain kind of status. Or maybe it was the other way around. Sudden social status gave me a certain kind of ease. At first I felt an intoxication from this shift, but then I began to feel like I was inhabiting a role that represented everything I'd always wanted to challenge. Elise and I were becoming an item for the disaffected kids on campus, the ones with dyed hair who studied semiotics. Older students. They saw our confidence and came right up to befriend us, bring us to parties where only upper-class students were invited. I mean upper class as in older. We were the new item, a prize traded for avant-garde cachet. I'd never been that kind of item before, and it made me feel grandiose and then emotionally dead. Elise and I would talk about who was crazy and who was insane. Crazy was good, but insane was even better. One night, Elise saw the world in blocks. She was surrounded by blocks, fetal position on the ground, her eyes in permanent panic from a Robitussin high. When we were on mushrooms, I got scared because Elise was on a different level of reality. I wanted her to come back to this level, but she kept changing her sweatshirt and her expression. You keep on changing, I will not know who you are. Elise left a note. Death is room temperature. Maybe that was it. We were finally finding a place where we could be dramatic and then talk about it. My body felt like broken shards. I was ruining my life to beat my parents on their terms. I'd come to Brown to look for activism, and instead there was so much apathy. Why were people so apathetic? And scheming. Everyone was scheming. Like there was some high-stakes game to find it. Find it now. It was me. Us. Have you tried this? Try it. Everything in my life had been leading up to this point. I grew up believing that I was evil, that if anyone ever saw my true self, they would know I was a monster that deserved to die. And I didn't want to die, except when I wanted to die, but I didn't want to know that, and so I knew that I always had to hide everything. I had to hide everything so they wouldn't know. They were parents and teachers and kids at school, grandparents too, and everyone else. I wanted them to think I was perfect. Since I always did well in school, it was always assumed that I would go to a good college. I mean, that was assumed for everyone in my school, but some of us would go to college and some of us would excel. And I was one of the kids who everyone believed would always excel. This was childhood. I needed to do better than my father. He went to Oberlin medical school, became a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist. I had to go to a more prestigious school, become more successful, buy a bigger house, make more money. This was the only chance I had, the only chance not to die. Except then I started to realize that was death too. That's when I knew I was trapped. So I didn't last very long at Brown. I left after a year and fled to San Francisco. And I think I'm going to read a little bit about when I first arrived in San Francisco. And so in a book called The End of San Francisco, of course, there's a chapter called The End of San Francisco. And of course, that chapter is about the beginning, when I first moved there. And I'm going to read from the middle of the chapter. I think I'm just going to read one little brief section first. After tasting this word lozenge. When the microphone goes off, suddenly my voice gets more hoarse. I don't know what that means. They took our microphone away. But we can take the chandeliers then, right? So this takes place early 90s in San Francisco, and let me think. Yeah, I'm just going to read a very short part first. We were scarred and broken and brutalized, but determined to create something else. Something we could live with. Something we could call home or healing or even just help. I need help here. Can you help? We were incest survivors, dropouts, whores, runaways, vegans, anarchists, drug addicts, sluts, activists, and freaks trying not to disappear. We paraded down the streets in bold and ragged clothes, too big or too small. We shared thrift store treasures and recipes and strategies for getting day-glow hair to last. We exchanged books and zines and flyers and gossip, got in dramatic fights over politics, over the weather, over clothing, over who was sleeping with whom. We held each other, we painted each other's nails, and we broke down. Honey, we broke down. We were the first generation of queers to grow up knowing that desire meant AIDS, meant death. And so it made sense that when we got away from the other death, the one that meant marriage and a house in the suburbs, a lifetime of brutality, both interior and exterior, and call this success, or keep trying for more brutality. But when we got away, it made sense that everywhere people were dying of AIDS and drug addiction and suicide, because we had always imagined death. Some of the dead were among us, just like us, just trying to survive. Others were more in the distance, the elders we barely got to know, except as we lost them. We went crazy and cried a lot, or went crazy and stopped crying, or just went crazy. We believed it was us against them. They were straight people. They were abusers. They were rapists and landlords and cops. They were parents and politicians and anyone with designer clothes. They were the gay people who congregated in the Castro. Apathetic, straight-acting gay men who went to the gym and dressed like clones in white t-shirts and baseball caps. Gay men who hated women and fat people and people of color and sissies and anyone who was different, really. And we were different. We were absolutely certain of that. We were vicious and vibrant. We judged with a purity that can only be imagined when you're really imagining. We held elaborate conversations, debates really, about when and where it was appropriate to shoplift. Some of us thought anywhere was okay because the actual crime was the selling and marketing. Unless we had control over it and were selling something like time with the bodies we were learning to call home. Sex work didn't feel like shopping, at least not for us because we were the ones selling. Sometimes you worked under some boss with sex work too, and then it was just as exploitative. They stole from us, but usually we got paid better than at a coffee house. Although it changed us too, and that wasn't always a good thing. Some of us thought you could steal from chain stores, but not independent stores. Some of us decided that anything posh made a legitimate target, or anywhere that sold meat. Or maybe someone we knew got fired, so that meant we had free reign and even insider tips. But it's also true that people ended friendships when they thought someone was getting carried away. Not carried away in the glamorous way. Like when you walked into a store with a friend and carried a futon outside to your car and drove off. That made you a legend. But if you started stealing from your friends, you were becoming someone to avoid. One of the most popular posters at the time was the one that said, "I don't think I'm going to work today. I don't think I'll go to work tomorrow." Your body is a battleground was everywhere also. My favorites were the homo cult posters. "Give us your children. Well, we can't fuck, we eat." Most people thought the best job was welfare if you could still afford your rent. Even better if you proved yourself crazy and got SSI, because that was permanent. Although those of us who got arrested doing civil disobedience were worried about SSI because we thought it would make it easier for them to put us away. Maybe it was okay to work at somewhere dead end that could still be used as a resource, like a copy shop. A corporate job could be overlooked as long as you didn't care about it and you brought home free office supplies and complained all the time, and then maybe you eventually became a stripper, or you became a stripper while you were still working at the corporate job. But if you started moving up at the corporate job, beyond something like data entry or telemarketing, then you might be getting suspicious. Although, if you grew up on welfare, that was different. Even moving up at a corporate job wasn't necessarily suspect. The worst thing anyone could say about someone was that they might have a trust fund. That meant they couldn't be trusted. No, the worst thing anyone could say was that you're a rapist with a trust fund. We argued about revolution. Most of us thought it was the stupidest thing we'd ever heard of. You just take power and oppress everyone else, right? But then there were the ones who believed we were the stupid ones because we didn't believe. We argued about drugs. Drinking and pot were always okay, unless you started flaking out and couldn't leave the house. And some of us liked all drugs, the more the better. But then others liked everything except crystal and heroin, or everything except heroin. Most people thought heroin meant you would eventually steal from your friends, which was almost as bad as a trust fund. Coke wasn't around, even though I was always looking. Some of us were vegans. We were trying not to participate in any form of animal cruelty, and we looked at everyone else like they didn't have enough courage. Some of us believed in activism more than anything, sometimes even more than we believed in our friends who weren't activists. But then some of us thought activism was stupid. You must have a trust fund if that's what you believed in. We were all sluts. Or if we weren't sluts, then we were trying to be sluts. And if we weren't trying to be sluts, then we were talking about sexual abuse. Although we could also talk about sexual abuse and sluttiness, the two together. And we knew this made us stronger. Obviously, we believed in attitude. If someone said something about not wanting to judge people, that was New Age garbage. New Age garbage was almost as bad as a trust fund. It was the same thing as stealing from your friends because you were stealing their rage. There was good drama and bad drama, but there was always drama, and this didn't necessarily feel uncomfortable because we had always known drama. I'm talking about us, because that's what we believed. We thought we were creating our own system of understanding, our own values, our own way of challenging the status quo. I don't know if I'll ever believe again. And that's why I'm writing this. I don't go to the mission now, or I try not to go. If I go, then I go in a different way. Not just because of the partying suburbanites who live there now. They live everywhere. We were once partying suburbanites too, many of us, but we came to San Francisco to escape. There are still people who come for the same reasons, but they don't find what they're looking for, or what I was looking for. Or if they do find it, then I still can't believe. Some of us had grown up rich and more of us poor, but we could see the way that queer freaks and artists and activists made the mission a safer place for the yuppies we despise. We dyed our hair crazy colors and pierced and tattooed whatever we could think of, but still we were mostly white and young and hip, even if we would have denied the young and hip part. We brought the trendy restaurants and boutiques that we stared at with anguish and disgust. The yuppies we scorned. It was our fault that the mission was no longer known primarily as a high-crime Latino neighborhood or just a place for thugs and welfare cheats and crack addicts on disability. We were the beginning of the end, and we didn't know what to do because we just found the beginning. When Elise and I moved into our own apartment in the Mission, we found a place 1 block from ACT UP meetings, 2 blocks from Junk, our favorite club, 3 blocks from Rainbow Grocery. Most of our friends lived within 10 blocks, and the rest of them wanted to. Someone was always having a potluck or an activist meeting, and if there wasn't a potluck or a meeting, then maybe margaritas a las rocas, or some party where everyone would argue, or try not to argue but get in fights anyway. Even in our kitchen, sometimes there were different allegiances, and we argued about that too. It felt important to argue, to figure everything out. This was when I went to D.C. for the March on Washington in 1993, a spectacle of assimilation if there ever was one. But also I met Z. We slept together and then got arrested together. What could be more romantic? And then we got bashed, and already we were taking care of one another. Soon he moved to San Francisco to join me, although we didn't call it that. He said he was already planning on moving to San Francisco. When Z arrived, I was in the middle of a 2-week dance intensive, getting up in the morning to do contact improv all day, and then afterwards I was worn out and drained, but there was someone else there, my body and this boyfriend. Our bodies, and there was the way he held me, but mostly his eyes. They would always get glossy when he looked at me, even when we were fighting, which happened pretty soon, but what happened sooner was that I remembered I was sexually abused. Z was telling me about a professor who raped him, and I was holding him but thinking, why can't I feel it? Or actually, I went past the not feeling to thinking, why? Why get so upset about something like that? It's happened to me hundreds of times. I was looking at the outline of Z's face, and there was an extra dimension. Everything was moving diagonally upwards and back. Not just a physical dimension, but an emotional dimension of terror. I shut my eyes and saw a cylindrical blue metal tunnel like my grandmother's laundry chute to fall into and get out of the house, but it was floating, shifting angles. Layers of fluorescent dots and chains, blue, lavender, green. Remembering when I was a kid and I couldn't sleep because of the dots. I thought it had something to do with the way I shut my eyes too tightly. I'd wake up screaming and my mother would soothe me back to sleep. I'd see faces in the navy blanket, eyes on my walls in the same terror, like something horrible was gonna happen and there was nothing I could do. I used to think that dots related to atoms, that somehow I could see the structure of things. Afraid of the dark, keep my entire body covered, even my head, run for the light in terror if I need to get up. Everything in the room was flickering and shaking, no stillness except for my body. I was crying like I did when I was 4. I could feel it was exactly the same. I wrote, is it something to do with my father, his naked body? Just that sentence. I mean that sentence among everything else I was feeling. Z knew what it meant. He'd already dated someone who'd been sexually abused. He saw it when there were places where I didn't want him to touch me, toward my neck or down my belly, and I would freeze. I just thought that was sex. I leave, they can have fun. No one had ever noticed before. How lucky to live in this house in the Mission, in a culture that talked about rape. A culture where we could go crazy and it was okay. It made sense. Sometimes it was the only thing that made sense. So you might have noticed I changed my mind about how long of that section I was going to read, because originally I was just going to read a very brief, and then I was like, well, that's not really a good encapsulation. So I gave a little more of an arc. So I think I might just read one more excerpt and then we'll have time for questions, conversation, intimacy, explosion, extravagance, transformation, transcendence, and anything else we want, right? So feel free to get your questions ready. Yeah, so I'm going to read from the end of the book. Which, of course, is about the beginning, as they said. This is from a chapter called The Beach. It was hard for me to get to the makeup counter. I didn't know what to say. I'm looking for a base to cover up my acne. I mean, my mother's acne. I was on the way from school to my father's office. I would wait for him until he was done with his patients, and then he would drive me home. I stopped at Woody's to look for that base, but I was too scared to talk to the person at the makeup counter. So I ended up buying Evian water in a metal can with a nozzle so you could spray a delicate mist over your face. Actually, in the DC humidity, it was wonderful. Did I have the Woody's credit card yet? No one used that one much. It wasn't upscale enough, but now they were renovating. But then the bathroom, black tile, and I'm standing at the urinal because that's what my father says I'm supposed to do. Even though it's hard not to get too nervous that someone will think I'm looking. There it is, reflected in the black tile. This guy next to me, he drops his hand. I can't breathe. I drop my hand too. He's looking. I reach for his dick and it's spongy, warm. He reaches for mine and we stand there like that for maybe 30 seconds or 3 minutes or 3 years. There's no way to know anything except I can't breathe and this warmth in my hand, and then someone comes in and I pull back quickly, stuff it into my pants, walk as fast as I can without looking like I'm running, out the back door, down the hill and up the block to my father's office. First, there was the end of everything. And then there was childhood, a trap. And then there was that place between childhood and the world. Here I am at 12 again, standing in a field. I'm wearing the same colors as the scenery, my hair reddish in the setting sun with the reddening leaves of the trees, green shirt blending into the evergreens, navy pants between the mountains and sky. When did my father and I start those bike rides? Another opportunity for him to scream at me. Scream because I was going too slow over bridges. I was worried I would fall off. Scream at me when he was trying to teach me to throw like a boy. This was baseball, the first sport I was required to take, but it didn't work out because I was afraid of the ball when they threw it in my direction. Here's the entrance to our bike ride, a small parking lot. There's always a Mercedes parked there. The same Mercedes, an old sedan in that color, somewhere between green and brown. A color so ugly to me that I imagined it could only mean you knew you could never fail. Except then it's actually for sale. For sale at a low price, and I try to convince my father. The park. There must have been something pretty about the park. I just remember trying not to fly off bridges. Maybe the trees and the light in the air. Yes, sometimes the air when we went fast or slow when he wasn't yelling at me for something, nothing. And one time I fell and hit my head and we went to the hospital and I needed stitches. And after that I wore a helmet. We wore helmets and then there wasn't any air anymore. The next sport was basketball. They said I was tall. I would be good at basketball. I couldn't understand the connection between my body in this room, the ball in my fingertips, and legs. We settled on soccer. No, we didn't settle. They just left me there on that hill in all that sun and loneliness. Soccer was better because I could kick the ball and then everyone would go away for a few minutes. Somehow, I got to the makeup counter again. I was looking for a suitable base for my mother. She had the same skin color as me. Oh, we could test it out on my wrist. What a good idea. Maybe a cover-up for the under the eyes, too? How does that work exactly? And an eye cream for the bags under my eyes. I mean, my mother's eyes. A powder? What kind of powder would be best? By the time of that first bathroom, it was karate, the sport I was required to take. At least with karate, you were on your own. And they had these dance moves they called forms, where you twirled around to Beethoven. Wait, remember that picture of the girl building a heart-shaped sandcastle? I looked closer. That's not Cindy Pearls, it's me. But back to my parents. Secrets between children and the threat we pose. The biggest threat to the biggest secret is another secret. We didn't even know there was something to tell. Even though there is an end, there is no end. Never again, I would say, after every visit to the bathroom at Woody's or Mazza Gallery across the street, the mall fancy enough to think of itself as art, where I really wanted those Gautier sunglasses with the blue lenses, but they were more expensive than my sweaters, and there were no tags to change. Every day after school, even though I would always say never again, they would look at me with so much hunger. These men, old men mostly, older than my father and paler too. So many of them would get sweat-drenched and pink, and I would try not to feel it, what was happening between my legs. I didn't call it sex, not even to myself. I knew that if I ever mentioned it, then no one would ever let me be anything else. I would practice standing with my hands in my pockets and my knees slightly bent, head cocked up. Oh, that's this pose in the picture in front of a tiled wall in 1987, where I almost succeed at looking tough for the camera. There was always someone watching. Here's one from later, undated. I think it's later because my face has lengthened and I've moved on from that earlier pose into the same pose, but more defiant. I'm telling the camera, you don't matter. Nothing matters. I can see this kid in those bathrooms. I can see what they were seeing in this kid. So, now we come to the question, answer. Drama, devastation, transformation, transcendence, period. So yeah, well first I will say I'll be in Amherst, Mass on Thursday. I'll be reading at Food for Thought books. So if you know anyone in the, what are they called? The Colonial Valley? What is it called? Pioneer Valley. I knew it was something colonial. If you know anyone in the Pioneer Valley, pioneering, tell them to come out. Yeah, so I've been on a book tour. I went on 2 tours for this book, one in the spring, which is the West Coast, and in the fall I made my way across the country. And my final date after Amherst will be in Boston on December 11th at Harvard Bookstore. And I'll actually be in Boston for a month because I'm writing this new novel. It's called Sketch to See, and it takes place in Boston in 95, 96. And so I don't travel that much because I deal with all these debilitating chronic... Oh, look, is it back on? Look at that. Magic. Wow. This is really a question and answer session. Does it make it more intimidating or less? More dramatic? Okay, we like drama. Tell me if did you like it better? Was it more intimate before? More intimate before. Oh. Forget it then. We like intimacy. As long as you can hear me and everything. I think this is better for the reading, but for Q&A, yeah. Maybe every now, if I want to make a really good point. See, because this way you just whisper a bit. I'll be like, oh, I didn't know anything about those, the children that died. I don't know about the drones flying overhead. The occupation of, I forgot the name of this building. So yeah, and actually, if people want, if you want to be on my extremely occasional email list, I only send emails out when I have a tour or when I'm soliciting contributions for a new anthology. And for me, it's really important when I'm working on a new anthology, I want the call for submissions to go out as widely as possible, because I think so often in publishing, it becomes this rarefied in-speak kind of very insular thing, and the kind of secrecy of how things happen is, very guarded, even among, and actually especially among smaller independent presses in certain ways. And so for me, it is possible that I may be embarking on a new anthology soon. So if you want to be on that list, I'll send out a little sign-up sheet. Does someone have a pen? I bet there's a pen. Can we borrow your pen? Oh, yeah. So yeah, what questions do people have? I'm going to jump up and down, stretch my legs. Maybe I'll move around. Yes?
So I'm in Professor Weiss's class.
Perfect.
We read the whole memoir.
Wonderful.
And reading it, there's a way in which you use the structure, and not the big overall structure, but within sentence and within paragraph, to sort of emulate the experience. It's it almost reflects, when you're at Brown and you're high, reading it is you're high, But I'm wondering how much of that was that was the only way to write it for you, or how much of it you went back and edited so that it did that.
Definitely. I would say it's both. I think when I write, I really do want to be in the experience of it, and I want the structure of the writing to reflect that. So say the last section that I read from, which really circles back in on itself over and over again, I really want it to be in that emotional space of that time between childhood and the world, the time when I felt I was always trapped, I would never get anywhere, there was no hope, but we read this book, right? There's this whole other arc. And so it's that moment of self-awareness and coming into self, but I wanted the trappedness, And I think the whole book in a certain way is this kind of circling around. It's I'm circling around my memories, so politically, socially, sexually, emotionally, ethically, and their undoing, and trying to figure everything out. And I think, yeah, I want the reader always to experience the writing. I don't want it to be this distant kind of explication, because I feel that takes away from the emotional experience of the writing. And so for me, it is really important to have the writing reflect what's happening, and have what's happening sort of reflect the writing, and part of that is in the writing process, but also I'm a really neurotic editor, so even though it was very important for me to maintain a spontaneous tone and texture to the book, I had 13 drafts. And the book started actually with 1,200 pages of material. So, and then I edited it down. It's I think like 182. So it doesn't exactly, the closest thing to the original writing actually is the first chapter, which is perhaps the most linear and the most perhaps easily discernible in the way that people generally think of writing. And that's when I went to visit my father as he was dying of terminal cancer. And I had told him 11 years before, when I confronted him about sexually abusing me, that I would never speak to him again unless he could come to terms with it. And then he was dying and had not, acknowledged anything, and I decided to visit him anyway. And I decided to visit him because I thought, well, 20 years down the line, I won't be able to make that choice. So I might as well make that mistake now, and then I can regret a mistake that I made rather than one that I can't make, And so I went there, and what surprised me is how vulnerable I was able to be, and so present in all of my emotions, even things that I never thought I would even feel. Like I told him that I loved him, and I was like, what? But I was saying everything that was happening in that moment. Even he couldn't even tell me that, And I told him that it would still mean something. It actually would change my life if he could acknowledge sexually abusing me, that was something he could give me, that he was going to die, and it was not going to do anyone any good for him to hold that secret, and actually he could help me. And he did not acknowledge that. But being so present in that vulnerability, I wrote that writing very similar. I mean, it's still edited a lot, but that's the closest thing to the original writing of it. And because I think it felt so clear, and so it is much clearer in, say, the conventional way that people think about writing. And I was a little worried, actually, when I put this book out, because I got feedback from, usually when I'm during the editing process, I have maybe I'll send it to 4 or 5 friends who are other, writers who have books out, and to critique it, before, generally before sending it to publishers. And this one person who I thought would have really good feedback, she was like, I love the first chapter, and then the next chapter, it's just like a mess. I don't know what's going on. And I'm like, but that's the point, And so I was really worried that every critic would say that, because the first chapter is more what people want from writing, especially from memoir, And luckily, that hasn't happened at all. I've been shocked that people have actually really entered the emotional resonance of the book and understood the stylistic challenges and experimentation that it's engaging in. I mean, partly because I was very careful to have this Q&A to send out with it that basically said that, but so that's been kind of exciting. But yes, that's a little bit. Yes.
Going off of that, can you talk about why you chose to write the first chapter that way? In that sort of more it does sort of set. I'm also in the services class, and it does sort of feel somewhat separate because it is so linearly structured.
Totally. Well, I think because that is how I felt it. And so the book is structured by feeling. And so I didn't want to, I feel like that is very much the feeling. It felt monumental in the moment. And so therefore it has this clearer arc, And so the second chapter, which is about dancing, going to clubs and the possibilities from that and no longer having those possibilities due to chronic pain and, hypersensitivity and fibromyalgia and, kind of chronic health issues. And you don't know that, of course, as you're reading it, but that part is and in a way, I feel like each chapter is its own world, and they all have their own structure that they're beholden to, and I really, that's actually interesting too. Actually, that was actually the same person who had that she said that every chapter. So a lot of things she said were really useful because I was like, oh, that's exactly what I want to do. She was offering it as a critique, but I was like, great. But she was like, why does every chapter feel like it's in a different book? And I was like, oh, that's great. I'm so glad, So yeah, I think I really wanted to be present in what the feeling was that taking place, And I think all my writing is voice driven, and so the voice is what guides it through. But here I think equally it's the feeling, And also I was really drawn to vulnerability. And so the first chapter, actually the clarity is what makes it vulnerable. And because it felt so clear, to impose a less linear structure actually for me would work against that, And so generally I think a less linear structure allows for more emotional engagement, But in that case, that's not what it would have done. It would have been kind of like an obfuscation and like imposing a structure just because like I like to write that way or something, And like I happen to think the second chapter that this one critic thought, was like a mess. I was like, that's how I want to write all the time, if I could. But I don't want to impose that, on the writing. I want it to be there on its own terms so that when people read it, they can read on the terms of the writing. Yes. Other questions? Yes?
Do you tend to do like handwriting or like typing or dictating? Like what kind of like transmission styles do you?
Sure. I write on the computer now, and I use voice software. And I use voice software because of chronic pain. So I would type if I had a choice, but now, and actually maybe not now. I mean, the voice software, when I first started using it, I think around 2003, probably a little earlier. It was probably around 2001, let's say. And it was version 3 then. Dragon Naturally Speaking, that's the program I use. And it was shit, you know what I mean? Like, it was like, it took a year, literally a year, for me to get it to type anything like what I was saying. It was horrible. It was like horribly frustrating. I only did it because I was desperate. And I was like, this is what I do. I need to find a way to use it. But although in the interim, my second novel, So Many Ways to Sleep Badly, that I wrote as the chronic pain was becoming debilitating. And in the past, I had always written in that way, like something would happen and I thought, well, if I don't write this down right now, I'm going to die, That was writing. And I'd be like, oh, and I'd be like, okay, I'm done. And then maybe I wouldn't write for a few weeks, And until the next thing happened, and I was like, I need to do it, And when I first developed the chronic pain, I got worried because I was like, well, writing is what I do to keep myself alive, Writing is how I express myself. It's this one art form that I feel like I always have access to. And how am I going to have that access? And so I decided with that book, as an experiment, I thought, well, I'm an experimental writer. I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to take this idea of nonlinear form and take it further. So I'm just going to write 2 paragraphs a day with no intention of plot or structure or anything. Then when I have 200 pages, I'm going to look at it and see what it is. And so I wrote, and of course, as I wrote, there were things that attracted me, especially in that condensed way. Sometimes maybe it was paragraphs, sometimes maybe 5, but, a small amount per day. And so there were things like music. I realized I really like to write about music. I like to write about NPR and Whole Foods and gentrification and macro decay, like impending U.S. war in Iraq. So this was, this was like 2003, 2002, about roaches and rats and pigeons, about sex, bad sex, about turning tricks for a living, about incest flashbacks, about conversations, like people would call me on the phone and I'd be like, put that in, and so the same person would sort of repeat themselves. And so the structure was based on the repetition of these voices, about theme and voice. And then I ended up with 400 pages. I was like, what the hell? How did I do that? I had never had 400 pages of something before, because my previous novel I actually wrote, originally it was short stories. And so that's how I originally wrote that book. And then, but after that, the voice software, and it took a really long time, because writing by hand is very different. It's not, people say, oh, voice software, that must be great. And I'm like, well, it takes a while for you to actually figure out how to write how to get it to write, you know. I mean, initially it took forever because I would say, I went to the store and it would say, bomb the White House, you know. And, and so I couldn't go back and edit it because it made no sense, you know. It made some sense, but no sense that we would ever consider, of course. But now it's sort of integrated into my process, so I kind of talk like I write, you know, to the software. Although in a more, because it doesn't do like say if I get, you know, change my voice a lot, it doesn't do that. So I have to be very like, you know, have a very rhythm. But it's been very helpful, you know, over the last few years for sure. Now that I have it, it still will crash. It crashes anything will crash. It's a very resource-intensive application, as they say. So yes. Other questions? Yes.
Do you think that the chronic pain has anything to do with the structure of the books that you're writing?
Well, it's interesting. Definitely with So Many Ways to Sleep Badly, it is sort of, the book actually follows, because I wrote it, because it's all written in the moment, you know. I mean, obviously it's been edited, but the way it's written, so these themes emerged that I really had no, I wasn't necessarily intending. I mean, some of them I intended as I wrote it, but and one of them is chronic pain, and it starts with like a repetitive stress injury diagnosis, and by the end it's like all these doctors like talking about fibromyalgia, and so the pain. And definitely it's very frenetic, and in every paragraph, maybe like 6 different things will happen, and you don't know, is that on the phone, is that outside, is that in the apartment, is that in the narrator's head? And I feel like that relates a lot to the chronic pain, you know, and also the arc of the book also kind of follows the chronic pain, and the chronic pain follows the arc. This book, I feel like at this point it's so integrated into my life, you know. It is, whereas it started, let's say, in 2000, when I first started getting this burning sensation in my wrist, it was like something that I thought was like, oh, a new muscle or something, and it's going to change, you know, and get better. And then it just got worse, you know, I couldn't open doors, and I couldn't chop vegetables, and and then since then, it's kind of like, you know, it changes depending on how I am, but it, you know, it's been integrated into my life, you know, and disability in both the conventional limiting sense of the word and also the politicized possibility of the word is also part of my world, you know, and so in writing this book, and so it's infused my experiences, and since this book is about my thinking about, you know, my own formations, like it's very much a part of it in that way, and also a part of me and how I, you know, think about, say, activism, for example. Whereas in the past, or some of what I describe in this book, you know, is kind of activism like, you know, chaining myself across the street and getting dragged off, the kind of things that I can't do now, you know, and a lot of the kind of like direct action street activism that I used to, like the thing that makes it so vibrant often is the risk-taking. And for me, making risks with my body, since I'm already in pain all the time, is not really a choice that I want to make, you know? And so yeah, in this book that plays out in a lot of different ways, you know. I think, and usually in a sort of the way where you don't know where it's coming from as the reader, but then it sort of hits you kind of in the end of the chapter, like the chapter about dancing, for example, which ends up being a chapter about not being able to dance in the same way, or at all in those particular spaces, clubs in particular. So yeah, thanks. Yes?
You said that you want to be in the experience of something when you're writing about it, and I was wondering, do you have like practices or methods for like getting into the headspace of like the past or like the possibility of the past? Like how do you do that? That's
a good question. I think No, I would say for me, well, okay, here's the way this book emerged was actually, I guess my process is basically, I don't necessarily generally have an intent for what I'm writing. So a lot of this book, actually, especially when it became a book called The End of San Francisco, I remember I was writing about the band La Tigra, and I was like, why am I writing about La Tigra? Or actually, and then it ended up being about Riot Girl, which was even weirder because I was like, Riot Girl never meant anything to me. Like, why the hell am I writing about Riot Girl? But I keep writing, and then eventually, of course, it becomes about me. And so that was something I really wanted to maintain in the book, is like that sense of like, I was searching for something in the writing, but I didn't know what it was. And then it came out through the writing. So I think that's probably my most of what I write comes out that way. I mean, definitely some of the parts of the book most overtly about San Francisco, they came in last. And definitely when I was writing, actually even more so for the book I'm writing now, Sketch to See, which is a novel, it's fiction, but a lot of it starts with my personal experience, and then it goes somewhere else. But I really went back and read my journals for that. And the journals, I never wrote journals like, it's funny what we write in journals, like a lot of what I wrote is like, I'm like, why did I write this? Because because I don't explain anything, because I'm like, of course I know whatever, right? So, but they would be like clues. So there would be like a sentence or two, and I was like, oh my God, that's exactly, because I was trying to get this narrator who was very similar to me to have the voice of this time, like 95, 96 in Boston. And I have a few things that I probably would not have remembered in the same way, or even just random things like a name of a place. And even with nothing else, like I'm like, oh, I went to the Someday Cafe, and I'm like, what the fuck was the Someday Cafe? So I think that's my main process, is not to think too much about, not to be like, oh, today. I mean, I think it's harder with an essay, say, for example. Like if I'm like, I want to write an essay about gay marriage, then it is about this specific thing, and it's not, it could work on some level to end up writing about chandeliers on the ceiling, but maybe not in that way. And that's why I don't like doing that writing as much, actually. Even if it may be some of the writing that I'm most known for, But I think that's my main, the main thing is for me just to trust what's coming out and not to be so worried about like, oh my God, I'm not writing the right thing, but more to be like, here it is, let's just see what the fuck happens. And the thing about writing is you can always change it, I think a lot of people get caught in this thing like, oh my God, this is shit, or something. And of course it's shit, you know what I mean? Like most writing when you write it is shit. Like, and then you make it into something else, And I mean, we all have different opinions about what shit is, and some of us might even like shit. But apparently most of the general public and the publishing industry likes shit a lot. But I think that for me is the most important thing, is just getting things on the page. And so whatever comes out, like whether it's from a prompt or whether it's just from, boom, here it is, And sometimes, like say with this book, when I originated with 1,200 pages of material, and then I took it and I sort of arranged it thematically. And so, for example, I had probably about 250 pages, which that's a whole book, right? About what I would term kind of trying to regain a sense of hope in my own sexuality. And that 250 pages now is a chapter of 15 pages. And so people say, well, what did you do with the rest of the 250 pages? And it actually is good writing, And I'm like, well, that became this 15 pages. It's in there, And so sometimes that's how it works, And maybe I will go back and look at the other writing. I don't know. But I know that there are parts where I was like, I love this, but I have to give it up. This is beautiful, but I don't want 200 anecdotes because it's too much for what I want to do. I want, let's say, 40 or 30, or, instead of having them be 10 pages each, I want to make them 2 paragraphs, to get the same feeling of that 250 pages, that same sense of being stuck, that same sense of searching, that same sense of finding moments of transformation, but them all leading to walls, And so yeah, that's a little bit of a process. Yes?
So kind of going back to the earlier idea that was touched upon, it seems like the idea of participation is like really pervasive throughout the memoir. Participation in sexuality, in activism, in sort of like the systems of oppression that you strive to fight through activism through your own daily life. And you touched upon how, particularly with activism, your ability to participate in a more direct way has changed. And I wonder if your ideas of what participation can mean have also changed.
I think my ideas about access have changed a lot. My ideas of what participation, I'm not sure if that has changed as much. I mean, definitely in the past, say when I was 19, 20, 21, even up into my, mid-20s or something, definitely I felt like the more risk-taking, the better. I still think that, actually. But I think, obviously, for some people can't take the same risk. And I knew that then, too, but not from my own experience, in a certain sense. And I always really felt like, and actually a lot of, say, like the group, the most recent activist group that was most central to my life, which was Gay Shame, which was a radical queer activist group in San Francisco. I mean, it still exists in some form, but when I was involved, it was like 2000, 2006 in creating it. And it, it really became my life in many ways, and the end of my involvement came about because of the end of my belief in the relationships that were formed through it. And I mean, a lot of that is in this book. But I think that changed my way of thinking about activism more than anything else, in a way. My sense that we were creating these relationships based on the shared values that we had built together, and then realizing, oh, actually that's not the case. And that's maybe something that's happened in my life in many areas now, and what the book is about, in a way, the end of San Francisco, invokes this idea of, say, a queer autonomous space, or a home for the fringe, or a place where marginalized queers can come together to cope, wherever that may be, and the ways in which we continually fail one another, and we build this bold rhetoric, but we don't actualize that rhetoric, and so often that rhetoric camouflages the same old tired violence, whether that's very similar to the violence of, straight or gay normalcy. And so in some ways, I think I'm in a place now where I'm trying to figure that out for myself, and also where I really see the limitations of things. I've always seen the limitations of things, but now perhaps I see them more from outside than inside, in some ways, in terms of, say, direct action activism. And the ways, by that I mean the limitations of how people can actualize certain things in a very limited realm, but can make no connections elsewhere. Even things just so simple as, like, say, being at a protest and having people know what the fuck is going on, and the sort of hierarchy between the people who know and the people who don't know, or like being at a protest and having like people who smoke, for example, maybe they shouldn't be smoking right next to your face, because people can't be there, just very simple things that are just like basic, and people don't go there, will not go there, and that to me definitely makes me question what is going on and what are these politics that we're engaged in, and in a quest for figuring out other things, which I've not figured out yet. And I think that's true also in relationships and in community building, both on the micro and macro level.
So maybe it's reception time.
Perfect.
There's vegan reception. And thank you so much.
Yes, thanks everyone.